Good evening. My name is Sade. I'm an undergraduate student here at The Ohio State University, majoring in psychology. And we'd like to welcome you to the annual campus-wide event of the Thompson Institute, a program of Crew at Ohio State. Our discussion tonight is an opportunity for OSU students, graduate students, faculty, and staff to come together to think deeply about important and relevant questions. The Ohio State campus is a marketplace of ideas. Those ideas that are embraced have influence on individual lives and in society well beyond the campus. The Thompson Institute seeks to thoughtfully consider these ideas and to humbly convey the wisdom, beauty, love, and the truth of Christian faith to the breadth of students and professors. Some of us come to tonight's dialogue with certain religious commitments and convictions. Others of us are skeptical about religion, and still others of us are unsure about our beliefs. Whether you believe or disbelieve this evening, our sponsoring organizations are sincerely glad you've come to explore this topic and consider the perspectives of both professors. We believe it is rare today to find productive dialogue between those with opposing perspectives. Our hope is that a respectful dialogue might be possible that can be carried forward by all of us, long after the event tonight has ended. No matter your religious or non-religious worldview, tonight is an opportunity for us all to be challenged. For those of us that identify ourselves as Christians, we hope that tonight will provide an opportunity to take seriously other perspectives so that we might think critically about our own beliefs and sincerely seek to understand those that are different from us. For those of us tonight to consider the Christian faith to be confusing, unattractive, or unreasonable, we hope that you find tonight's dialogue to be thought-provoking and that you might find ways to reconsider your own beliefs and your conceptions of the Christian faith. The title of tonight's discussion is this: Are you free? We have asked our presenters to answer questions like, what does it mean to be free? What does personal freedom look like? How does your religious or non-religious worldview correspond to your understanding of what it means to be free? Why does this topic matter to you? Tonight's Thompson Institute event is sponsored by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations, and Crew at OSU. Regarding the audience Q&A, if you have a question that you would like to submit for tonight's presenters, you can send a text message with your question to the following phone number: 614-600-2278. We will display the number again later on tonight when we transition to audience Q&A. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Baccio Borgiazzi, our moderator for this evening. Dr. Borgiazzi is a graduate of The Ohio State University, receiving his PhD in Old Testament Studies at Durham University. Dr. Borgiazzi is an adjunct professor at Ashland Theological Seminary, a fellow of the Thompson Institute, and helps give leadership to Crew at Ohio State. Please welcome Dr. Borgiazzi to the podium to introduce tonight's presenters.
Well, thank you. Let me introduce to you Dr. Erik Wielenberg. He did his graduate work at the University of Massachusetts and spent a year studying at the Center of Philosophy of Religion at the University of Notre Dame. His research is focused in ethical theory, particularly moral psychology, metaethics, and moral epistemology, and contemporary analytic philosophy of religion. He spent the 2014-2015 academic year at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where he was a fellow at the Center for Ethics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. Dr. Gregory Ganssle has been thinking about the intersection of Christian faith and contemporary scholarship for over 30 years. After graduating from the University of Maryland in 1978, he worked in campus ministry on a variety of campuses. He earned a Master's of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Rhode Island in 1990 and a doctorate in philosophy from Syracuse University in 1995. Dr. Ganssle was a part-time lecturer in the philosophy department at Yale for 9 years and a senior fellow at the Wielenberg Institute at Yale. Dr. Ganssle's research interests lie in the contemporary philosophy of religion and history of philosophy. Would you welcome our first presenter this evening, Dr. Ganssle?
Thanks, man. Good evening. I'm honored to be part of this program. It's my first visit to Ohio State University, and I'm honored to be sharing the discussion with Professor Wielenberg, who is an excellent philosopher. Each human being has a project. In fact, we all share the same project. This project is to navigate the world in the best way that we can. Each of us proceeds with the aim of being and doing certain things and not others. We navigate the world in light of our commitments and assumptions about what it is good to do or to be. These commitments determine what will make sense to us and what will not make sense. We aim to do the things that make sense to us and to avoid the things that don't. Small events or decisions make sense or fail to make sense if they connect or fail to connect with our bigger view of life. Thus, it is the larger questions that shape the smaller ones. Tonight, we're going to discuss personal freedom as an ingredient to a good life. In addition, we will discuss how our worldviews make room for our notions of personal freedom. I will argue that the Christian story has the resources for explaining and grounding personal freedom. I will not argue that the Christian story is true, although I think it is true. Rather, I will argue that the Christian story makes better sense of the role of freedom in our lives than many stories that do not involve God. We cannot take up this topic without asking what we mean by freedom. I take personal freedom to be integral to human flourishing. That is, to be free is to live the kind of life a human being ought to live. It means to embody and to practice the kind of virtues that constitute a good life. You might ask, why connect personal freedom with virtue at all? It seems to many people that moral categories impinge on our freedom. They obligate us to put aside our own interests and desires for something that is more important. To live morally is to turn away from some of these desires. This is the aspect of morality that requires that we push against our desires, and it's a central part of morality that Nietzsche sought to overcome. Nietzsche's critique resonates with many people. Why then connect freedom with virtue? Well, if we reflect on any traditional list of virtues, we can see that these qualities capture what most of us think will make for a better life. For example, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul offers a list of the character qualities that God wants to produce in human beings. The list is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. If we ask ourselves honestly what ingredients make up a life that seems free, these qualities would be on the list. We are free to grow and to develop rich relationships if we experience and express love, patience, and kindness. We are free to work hard and take risks for goals that are important to us if we experience peace, joy, and self-control. The lives we each want are lives characterized by qualities like these. Thus, our personal freedom is tied to practicing key virtues. Although we are talking about personal freedom, a good human life is not solitary. A person's excellence finds its expression in the relationships that are most important to her. Relationships are vital to our deepest desires and our sense of what makes up the best life. My ability to enter and sustain rich relationships is largely a matter of my practice of relational and moral virtues. As I practice these excellences, my own life is enriched, and I help others on the path to living well. In order to suggest that the Christian story has resources to explain the role of freedom, I will develop two claims. First, the Christian story provides a good explanation for the role of morality in our freedom. Second, the Christian story grounds the reality of hope. Concerning the role of morality, some philosophers will argue that without God there cannot be any objective morality. I want to make it clear that I think it is possible to have objective moral goods without God. There are a variety of ways this can be worked out. Since Professor Wielenberg also holds this view, it will not be an issue between us. Where the Christian story brings additional resources to our pursuit of the best life, then, might not be in grounding the truth of moral claims. It is found rather in the fact that the Christian story explains how the moral life is the better life for the human being. Professor Wielenberg in his books defends the idea that basic moral truths are kind of like the truths of arithmetic. They are necessary truths. If they are necessary, their truth does not have to be explained by God. It is important to note that this view is one that's also held by some Christian philosophers, such as Richard Swinburne. And this is a view that allows moral claims to be objective. The claim that the basic moral truths are necessary, however, is consistent with a view that they also depend on God. Augustine, for example, argued that Platonic forms are ideas in God's mind. This view is called divine conceptualism. Mathematical and moral truths, as well as abstract objects such as universals, are necessary elements in the divine mind. In this view, the truth of moral statements is independent of God's will, but their being still depends on the mind of God. Although the truth of moral claims does not need to be explained by God, there is something else that does require explanation. What still needs to be explained is the applicability of these moral truths. That is the fact that moral truths apply to us and contribute to our living better lives. Let me try to make this clear. Most versions of atheism hold that human persons arrived on the scene completely by accident. But if moral truths are necessary, they have always been true. We have a set of necessary moral truths that are, so to speak, waiting around. There is nothing at all to which these truths apply, and there is no guarantee that they will ever apply to anything. A chance process set in motion by the initial conditions of the universe continues for 13 or 14 billion years, and in the end, totally by accident, creatures emerge that can bear moral obligations. It is not that the emergence of life, and more specifically human life, is impossible on this view. This claim is not necessary for the point I'm making. What is surprising is that the creatures that emerge match the moral truths that have been waiting in the wings throughout the whole show. Not only does this match need explaining, there's another feature of morality that also needs to be explained. It is not just that creatures to whom moral truths apply emerged by accident. It is that following moral truths contribute to our flourishing rather than our languishing. Morality is good for us. On atheism, this fact is just a happy accident. The Christian story, in contrast, holds that human beings are created by a powerful and good agent for his own reasons. Some of these reasons are that we would reflect the divine character through embodying and practicing certain virtues. We were made to live in a dependence relationship to God and in a loving, serving relationship to one another. Furthermore, it is living this kind of life that brings personal freedom. So I would argue that even if basic moral truths are necessary truths, there remains things that are more difficult to explain without the purposeful activity of a good creator who shapes certain beings to fit moral reality. I'm not going to argue that the happy accident alternative is impossible. The Christian story has a better explanation. The second way the Christian story provides resources for personal freedom has to do with hope. Philosopher Robert Roberts characterizes hope as a construal of one's future as holding good prospects. Hope is a posture towards the future that shapes how we navigate our lives in the present. I will mention 3 ways the Christian story provides hope. First, we have hope that our moral failures do not have to be decisive. Second, we have hope that we can experience significant moral growth. Third, we have hope that our story is never over. First, our hope that our moral failures do not have to be decisive. In an account of objective moral truths without God, we stand in a kind of impersonal relationship to a set of moral truths. When we fail, we fail. Often our failures result in hurting other people. And while the people we hurt may forgive us and our human relationships may be restored, the moral law is in a sense unrelenting. It has no resources for forgiveness. We succeed or we fail. This fact about the moral law captures one of the ways Kierkegaard thought that remaining in the ethical stage of life can lead to despair. In the Christian story, our moral failures are not in the concept or in the context of an impersonal relationship to a moral law. Rather, we fail as we fail to live up to the purposes God has in creating us. God, who is wholly good and loving, has the ability to forgive such things. The Christian story includes the resources for handling this moral failure. Our ability to be forgiven looms large in this story. In fact, the central drama of the Christian story is the death and resurrection of Jesus in history as atonement to make forgiveness possible. Second, the Christian story provides hope that we can change. Now, it is not the case that atheist views of virtue rule out change and moral development. Aristotle was right when he said that we become virtuous by practicing virtuous actions. What the Christian story can add to a picture such as Aristotle's is that our moral development is not a project we face alone. God himself is active in producing these character traits in us. Our moral development is a result of our participation with him in the development of virtue. It is a startling thought that the creator of the universe is involved in the development of our characters. We participate or cooperate with God in this endeavor. Paul's list of character qualities I mentioned is instructive. He calls them the fruit of the Spirit. The metaphor of fruit is used often in the New Testament. Just as the fruit of a tree is a natural result of the healthy life of a tree, these qualities are the natural result of a life that cooperates with God's project of personal transformation. It is God who produces these qualities in us. This dynamic of cooperation is part of our dependence relation on God. We participate as we draw upon God's strength and take small steps in order to order our lives around the divine character. Third, freedom is enhanced because in the Christian story, our story is never over. Now, in America, when we think of the afterlife, we often think of pictures from Bugs Bunny cartoons. We picture disembodied subhuman souls floating on clouds. The reality is that the Christian view of afterlife is one of a resurrected, embodied existence. In a sense, we will be more fully human, not less human. The Christian vision of the afterlife shapes how we navigate the present. Our journey to become the people we ought to be will never be complete in this life. The promise of the Christian story is that we will experience completeness. We will become the people we were meant to be. In the new heavens and the new earth, spoken of in the New Testament, we will experience the humanity for which we long. The Christian story is not one of ultimate escape from humanity. It's a story of growing into our full humanity. Thus, we can face even suffering and aging with confidence. Personal freedom is part of the quest of every human being. It is tied to living well. The flourishing life is largely a matter of practicing virtues. The Christian story explains these realities better than atheistic stories. First, because it grounds morality deeply in the mind of God and explains why the morally good life is the humanly good life. Second, the Christian story provides the well-grounded hope that we will become the people we want to be. Thank you.
Behold the face of atheism. I'm very grateful to be able to participate in this event. I want to thank the organizers, and I especially want to thank all of you for coming out to listen to these ideas and hopefully think about them a little bit. So I want to begin with some areas of agreement between Professor Ganssle and I. Ganssle and I both look at the world and see a mixture of good and evil, and of beauty and ugliness. We agree that the world is, as Ganssle puts it, shot through with value. We also agree that meaningful relationships that are characterized by trust, love, encouragement, and gentle concern, are among the most important goods in human life. And we agree that human beings have certain moral obligations or duties, real, objective moral requirements that we cannot avoid. Now let me discuss two important areas of disagreement between Ganssle and I. First, Ganssle thinks that goodness, beauty, and love are deeply anchored in reality itself. This is because Ganssle holds that the foundation of reality, the most real thing there is, and the thing that is the ultimate source of everything else that exists, is the triune God of Christianity, a God of three divine persons, each of which lives in eternal self-giving to the other divine persons. This God is itself good, beautiful, and loving, and its presence at the foundation of reality explains and guarantees the presence of goodness, beauty, and love that exist in the universe. By contrast, I do not believe in the reality of the triune God of Christianity, nor of any similar God. And in my view, the goodness, beauty, and love that exist in the universe are, at a deep level, happy accidents. Fundamentally, it's a matter of dumb luck that these things exist. However, the fact that these things are happy accidents, whose existence is by no means guaranteed, does not make them any less real or any less valuable. To see this, imagine two intrinsically identical roses. The two roses have the same number of petals, the same exquisite rose color, the same perfect proportions, and so on. The only difference between them lies in how they came to be. The first rose is the culmination of the lifelong dream of a meticulous rose grower who picked the perfect location to plant the rose and carefully tended and protected it as it grew. The second rose sprouted from a pile of manure, into which a staggering drunk on his way home from the bar accidentally dropped one of the rose seeds his wife had asked him to purchase earlier that day. The first rose came into existence through a carefully conceived and executed plan. The second arose by dumb luck. Yet the two roses are equally beautiful and equally valuable. Their origins are irrelevant to the intrinsic value that they carry within themselves. When thinking about good and evil, an important distinction is the distinction between intrinsic good and evil on the one hand and extrinsic or relational good and evil on the other. Intrinsic value is the value a thing has in and of itself, independently of how it is related to other things. Extrinsic value is the value a thing has in virtue of how it is related to other things. A classic example of something that is merely extrinsically valuable is money. A stack of cash is valuable, but only because of how it can be used. A stack of cash existing in isolation on its own in an empty universe containing nothing else is entirely worthless. Love, by contrast, has intrinsic worth. Even in isolation on its own, in an empty universe containing nothing else, love is good. And because love is intrinsically good, it is good regardless of whether it's brought about through a carefully conceived and executed divine plan, or whether, like the second rose, the one that grew from the heap of manure, it's a result of dumb luck. So a second important disagreement between Ganssle and I involves personal freedom. As he explained in his remarks, Professor Ganssle takes personal freedom to be integral to human flourishing. Ganssle holds that an important part of personal freedom is the ability to become a virtuous person and live a life that contains goodness, especially the goodness of meaningful relationships. On Ganssle's view, every human being is guaranteed personal freedom. Every human being has the ability to become virtuous and happy. This is partly because, as Ganssle puts it, in the Christian story, our story is never over. Our earthly lives are just one chapter of our story, and so we have other opportunities for moral transformation and improvement. Furthermore, on Ganssle's view of things, the great good for human beings, the good that characterizes human flourishing, comes with closeness to God. And if this life is just one chapter in our story, then even if we don't achieve closeness with God in this life, we may be able to achieve it in a later chapter. On my view, by contrast, this is it. Our earthly lives are all that we get. There is no divine guarantee of personal freedom. And indeed, it's clear enough that if this is all we get, then many human beings live and die without having any chance of attaining virtue or happiness. Now, I suspect that most or all of us in this room are not in that category, and that is important. Most of us have the opportunity to make real progress in becoming better people, and most of us have meaningful relationships. Should the facts that many people do not have these opportunities, or that virtue is at best incomplete, and that love always ends, lead us to despair or hopelessness? Absolutely not. The things that are valuable in this life do not lose their value because they are happy accidents or because they are temporary. In fact, I'd say that recognizing that this is all we get should give us a greater sense of urgency. If there is to be virtue or happiness at all, it must occur in this life. If there is to be justice at all, it must exist in this world. Therefore, let us devote our efforts in the limited time we have to the pursuit of virtue, happiness, and justice. Consider the iconic figure of Frosty the Snowman. Like us, Frosty exists for a limited time only. Frosty was made of snow, we're made of dust. Like us, Frosty is aware of his predicament. The song that tells his tale includes this line, which I will read and not sing. Frosty the Snowman, it's very hard actually not to sing it. Frosty the Snowman knew the sun was hot that day, so he said, "Let's run, and we'll have some fun now before I melt away." Faced with his impending demise, Frosty adopted the philosophy of carpe diem, seize the day, and I submit that we should do the same. Now, I said earlier that Professor Ganssle and I agree that meaningful relationships are among the most important goods in human life. On Ganssle's view, this important good is deeply anchored in the foundation of reality because God is intrinsically relational. Ganssle also suggests that human nature is a picture or image of God's own nature, and that the human capacity for relationship is a reflection of the divine capacity for relationship. In the rest of my remarks, I will offer for your consideration a challenge to this aspect of Ganssle's view. The challenge is based on the presence in our world of psychopaths. Psychologists estimate that roughly 1 in 25 persons is a psychopath. Psychopaths are often described as lacking conscience, and the mainstream scientific view of psychopaths is that they have significant neurological deficits that leave them with an absent or significantly diminished capacity for love, compassion, and guilt. Most relevantly, psychopaths are incapable of and have no interest in forming meaningful relationships with others. One psychiatrist describes the psychopath's mindset like this: the paradigm of psychopathic emotional deficit might best be characterized as predator mode. Other people are seen as objects to be exploited for gain. The predatory psychopath treats others merely as means to an end and is puzzled at the suggestion that it could be otherwise. That such persons walk among us seems unexpected if the human capacity for relationship is a reflection of the divine nature. There's growing evidence that genetic factors make a substantial contribution to psychopathy. Based on research on the brains of adult psychopaths, teenage boys incarcerated in a maximum security juvenile prison, and children with callous and unemotional traits, neuroscientist Kent Keel concludes that it is likely that in many cases, the distinctive paralimbic atrophy of psychopaths is present from birth. Keel reports that every adult psychopath he has worked with was different from normal children from a very early age. Remember that on Ganssle's view, the great good for human beings comes with closeness to God, and the Christian vision of life insists that this union is possible to a significant degree in this life. It seems difficult to fit psychopaths into this Christian vision of life. If God loves all human beings and wants all of them to be able to participate in closeness with God, then why would he permit the existence of human beings who are utterly incapable of and disinterested in such closeness? The particular emotional deficits of psychopaths seem hard to square with Ganssle's Christian view of reality. Now, I should emphasize that when we try to determine whether Christianity or atheism is which is the more plausible, we should take into consideration a wide range of evidence. So even if I am right that the existence of psychopaths is hard to square with Ganssle's Christian worldview, that hardly settles the matter, since psychopathy is just one piece of evidence that should be taken into consideration. Finally, Professor Ganssle ended his remarks with some comments about hope. I'll do the same. Without God and an afterlife, we cannot reasonably hope for perfect justice, but we can hope for more justice. With all the evil and injustice in the world, and without a God who's on the side of goodness and justice, the struggle for justice can easily seem futile. But there's an old story that shows why it's not rational to succumb to this sense of futility. You may have heard the story before. It's called The Star Thrower, and it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was an old man who used to go to the ocean to do his writing. He had a habit of walking on the beach every morning before he began his work. Early one morning, he was walking along the shore after a big storm had passed and found the vast beach littered with starfish as far as the eye could see, stretching in both directions. Off in the distance, the old man noticed a small boy approaching. As the boy walked, he paused every so often, and as he grew closer, the man could see that he was occasionally bending down to pick up an object and throw it into the sea. The boy came closer still, and the old man called out, "Good morning, may I ask what it is that you are doing?" The young boy paused, looked up, and replied, "Throwing starfish into the ocean. The tide has washed them onto the beach, and they can't return to the sea by themselves. When the sun gets high, they will die, unless I throw them back into the water." The old man replied, "But there must be tens of thousands of starfish on this beach. I'm afraid you won't really be able to make much of a difference." The boy bent down, picked up another starfish, and threw it as far as he could into the ocean. Then he turned, smiled, and said, "It made a difference to that one." Justice isn't an all-or-nothing thing. It comes in degrees, and every little bit helps. In the Christian universe, God is going to make sure that all the starfish are okay in the end. In a godless universe, it's all up to us. We can't save all the starfish, but we can reasonably hope to save some of them, and that's exactly what we should try to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ganssle. Thank you, Dr. Wielenberg. Now we begin our moderated dialogue section of the evening. And just wanted to give you guys a chance to respond to one another. So, having heard each other's presentations, how would you respond in brief 2 to 3 minute period of time?
Would you like me to start?
Yes.
Okay. Great job. I think it's fascinating. I think one of the main things you raised that requires careful thought is psychopathy. Psychopathy, is that how you pronounce it?
That's how I say it.
Okay, well then I'll follow you. And I think psychopathy is a deeper challenge to the Christian story if we assume that every person in this life has to be able to experience character in a pristine way. And of course, my comments were more general about the population than about people who have severe genetic incapacities for these qualities. I think the Christian story gives us an explanation of why there can be people like this. And it's part of the broader story about the corruption of the moral or the natural order that happened with human rebellion against God, which is a long theological story. But it's also a case where the Christian story provides hope, because the hope is not just in this life. I mean, there are people who are both from psychopathy and other genetic or otherwise serious damages, incapable of entering into a moral life. But there is hope that they ultimately will be transformed and healed. And on a non-theistic story, it seems like there's no hope at all for such people. But it's a very important challenge. So that's one response on one point that I think is one of the important ones you raised.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I think the two things that I was sort of struck by the most, interested in, I think Professor Ganssle suggested that on atheism there might be objective moral truths. That's a controversial point itself. So I'm actually very happy that he sort of conceded that one. Thank you. But then you suggested a challenge that has to do with, I think the idea was that there are two sort of suspicious or hard to explain coincidences on atheism, even if we grant the reality of these objective moral truths. And as I understand it, the coincidences were, first, this idea that it seems kind of suspicious that the moral truths, if they're like the truths of mathematics, they were sort of there waiting for creatures to come along to which the moral truths would apply. And isn't it convenient that human beings show up and then the moral truths sort of apply to human beings? And I think the second coincidence was that it also seems convenient on atheism that morality tends to basically coincide. It tends to be good for us. It tends to contribute to human flourishing. So let me just offer a couple thoughts on those points, which I think are very interesting. Again, interesting challenge to think about. So I think on the first sort of possible or alleged coincidence, if we go back to the example or parallel to some extent with truths of mathematics, the way I would tend to think of it is the similar thing seems to be true of mathematical truths. So if we take, for example, that the area of a circle is pi r squared. I mean, it seems to me that this is just sort of a necessary truth. It's in the nature of reality, and so whether or not there are any actual physical circles, it seems that truth is sort of there. But then, depending on how things go in the universe, circles may appear or not, or they may come and go. But I guess I don't see it as sort of a weird coincidence that circles show up. I mean, it's just I don't think there's a sense that pi r, the area of a circle equals pi r squared is sort of waiting there. That's just how circles work if they exist. And if they happen to come into reality, then that truth will sort of become relevant. But if there are no circles, then that truth is still there, but just it's not relevant, doesn't apply to anything. And I would think of a lot of moral truths, along those lines. They're sort of there if the right sorts of creatures with the right psychological capacities come into existence. Then these moral truths will start to apply to them and will become relevant. But otherwise they don't. So I think there I'm not. I guess the thought I would, if we think about the math case, I'm not sure there's anything particularly suspicious about it on this way of looking at it. Try to be more brief on the second thing. So on the connection between morality and happiness, isn't it convenient that morality tends to conduce to human flourishing? I mean, there I would actually see that as a kind of conceptual truth. I mean, I think that's just part of the nature of morality. To me, it doesn't seem to really be possible, for example, that human beings, all of our moral obligations, if we fulfill them, could just contribute to complete human misery. In much the way that it's hard to, I don't think it's a coincidence that every square has four corners. That again is just part of the nature of a square. And I tend to think that it's part of the nature of morality, not that it contributes to the flourishing of every individual human being, but that in some way it contributes to the flourishing of humanity as a whole. I think is a sort of conceptual truth about the nature of morality. So those are some thoughts for consideration.
Those are great. Thank you for sharing those. Just as a way kind of to keep the conversation going, it might be good to say what is one question you would have for the presenter? It might be that you can pick up on this conversation or ask a totally different question, but what would be one question you would ask?
Maybe I would ask this. If you were to suppose that Christianity were true, would you grant that it has better explanations for the things that make up personal flourishing or personal freedom than your atheistic story?
So do you mean the existence of those things in reality?
The existence of those things, how they fit with human nature.
To me, what seems, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think on a non-theistic view like mine, I think there is a kind of explanation. It's going to be more, so it's going to involve a lot about evolution and the development of, evolution of human beings and so on. So it'll be a different type of story, sort of historical. It started with these organisms, and then it went, et cetera, and yada, 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 now there's human beings. But it wouldn't be the type of, story where it's the result of a plan that was, intended by a divine being, right? But I think that, for me, the big difference seems to be, so I guess I don't really see it as much of a mystery that there are human beings with obligations who can love each other and who can become more virtuous. I think, to me, the big difference is how far, is there a guarantee that everyone, can attain virtue and happiness? And I think atheism just, clearly does not provide any such guarantee, whereas in your way of thinking of Christianity, it does.
Yeah, well, at least I would say it could be within the access of every person. Ultimately, I think we have some choice about resistance, but that's a technical detail.
Yeah, right.
And what would be the question you would ask?
Okay, so now when I was thinking about this before, I was going to ask about what Professor Ganssle thought about psychopaths, but now he said a bit about that question. So now I have to think on the spot, and now all I can think about is Frosty the Snowman, but that's not gonna get us anywhere.
That's on most of
He
our
was
minds,
not a
anyway.
psychopath.
Yeah, well,
He was a good guy.
okay, we agree. Yeah. So can I pick up on? I was most interested in your thought that psychopaths could, since there's this further chapter, psychopaths could be healed in some way or restored. I mean, one question that does come to mind is why sort of permit them to be psychopaths in the first place?
Sure.
I did get, I guess, I mean, one thing that I thought you suggested, now I know you also said, well, maybe there are sort of exceptions, but I think you did say at one point that being able to get some kind of closeness with God would be, so important. This is the great good, the sort of union relationship with God in the Christian worldview is such an important good that I thought you suggested at one point that it would be accessible to some degree to every human being in this life. But it does seem that psychopaths, again, if we stick to this life, it just seems beyond their capacities, at least in some cases where they're literally incapable of love or that kind of relationship.
I may very well have implied that, right? But and the case of psychopath is a good reminder that there are, and that reminded me there are probably other cases that are not in this category. So I will be more cautious about how I frame that because there are these difficult cases. And of course, the question, why does God allow this kind of thing to happen, is part of the broader challenge of the problem of evil, which will be next year's topic with two different philosophers, I hope. I mean, the short answer, or I should say, the one important thing I have to begin with on that is I really don't know. I don't have access to God's reasons for particular things, and there are some things that seem very difficult. In the Christian story, we have some framework for what kinds of things might be God's reasons for some things, and we have a framework for how God will deal with people because of his loving, just character. So I have confidence that the answer is that God has a good reason, and this is why I think part of that reason is going to come in the second chapter, for people who suffer in this way. But I can't pretend to speculate what that could be. Right.
Okay. Well, I'm glad at least we have that shared understanding that Frosty the Snowman is a morally outstanding, upright member of the society. So that's a good start for our discussion. But I wanted to tease out a little bit of Dr. Wielenberg, your statement about that, really where rubber meets the proverbial road is in the concept of carpe diem. That it's all about like what happens now. And the interesting thing about that is obviously there's overlaps with ancient Christian spirituality, whether it's in Eastern Orthodox Church with Jesus Prayer and things like that, or in the Western tradition you have 17th century Jean-Pierre de Caussade, who talked about the sacrament of the present moment, or even 20th century writer by the name of Frank Lubach, that, really the idea is that carpe eternitas, that this idea of being people shaped by eternity make us more flourishing human beings in the now. And so it's kind of the same question. Now I'm going to kind of flip it and ask you the same question, but coming from a different angle. You were quoting Dr. Roberts in talking about hope, and then you mentioned hope is a posture towards the future that shapes how we navigate our lives in the present. Now, the common adage is that Christians are so heavenly minded that there are no earthly good. And obviously, having grown up in Soviet Union, my first exposure to that was, as I was thinking about in preparation for this, Maxim Gorky has a phenomenal play called The Lower Depths. And it's a story that takes place in this seedy bar. And, it's like people at the bottoms, at the lower society. And here comes this beggar by the name of Luca, who is supposedly a Christian. And he offers them the hope. He says, well, beyond this life lies peace. And then he suddenly, in the context of a play, he just disappears. And obviously, Maxim Gorky was a phenomenal writer, but he was a mouthpiece of the Communist Party. But the idea there was that this Christian hope leaves people with a status quo, that it does not give humanity the impetus to seek change. What would you say to somebody who says, well, in order to do carpe diem, we need to set aside our Christian convictions that encourage us to kind of like hope for the next chapter, but really kind of persevere or suffer or endure this chapter? So I guess it's the same question coming from a different angles. So whoever wants to go first.
You go.
Okay. So I think so I emphasized the carpe diem thing, and maybe I should just sort of emphasize that when I was saying that, I didn't mean to suggest that on the Christian view, this life would sort of not matter at all. It would only be the next chapter or the afterlife. I think that was part of what you were pointing out in your comments on it, and I agree. I do think, of course, that on the Christian view, it is forward-looking, and it does seem that the next chapter, the afterlife, perhaps is the most important thing. But I didn't mean to suggest that this life sort of doesn't matter. So I think I said in my remarks, if this is all there is, then perhaps that gives us a greater urgency. And I guess that part still I would agree with, which isn't to say that on the Christian view it doesn't matter at all. But again, it seems more precious if this chapter is the only chapter. Now, I think in the remarks you made to Professor Ganssle, I will now bring up Marx. But for the record, I didn't really do it. It was in the video that Marx was mentioned, so I didn't start this. Of bringing Marx into the discussion. But Marx, the comment in the video is this famous remark that Marx made that religion is the opiate of the people. And the idea, I think this is what you were suggesting in your remarks to Professor Ganssle, is that sometimes if you have a worldview, and I think Marx thought that Christianity was like this, that places emphasis on the next life, well, that could be a very useful tool for a government that wants to sort of oppress people, right? If you can convince people, well, this life isn't so important, it's the next life that really matters, well, they'll be less likely to, stand up for themselves and resist oppression and so on. So it can be a kind of tool of tyranny. And so I do think, again, it's not that on the Christian view this life doesn't matter at all, but if you think about it, this idea of this is all there is, that could motivate, political action, where if you're being oppressed and this is it, perhaps you'll be more motivated to stand up against that oppression than if you have in the back of your mind that, well, there'll be this other chapter that perhaps is more important than what's happening to me now.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I am going to agree with some of this. I mean, clearly, Christianity and other religions have been used in that way, and I think it's not just used by government or some oppressive regime, but adopted to get me off the hook from being involved in things, and that's a distortion of what the Christian story should motivate us to be about. But it clearly has been used that way on various kinds of issues, and so I am glad to admit that happens. I think the motivation is actually doubled for the Christian, because the Christian is cooperating with God's project now to bring as much healing as possible, and that project has a grounding not just in the carpe diem, that I can only do certain things now, but also in the fact that I am living in my dependence relationship with God. This has meaning that comes not just from the intrinsic, but from the outside as well, that enhances the meaningfulness of present action to sacrifice to help people. So I think it ought to work the other way. Granted, it doesn't always work that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's thank you for your comments. And it's kind of like one of the things, like even as we do surveys after these events, what students really want to hear is where some of these ideas intersect with life, and especially with your own lives. So my question for each one of you is, why is your worldview or the material that you just presented, why is it personally compelling for you?
Well, I'm not necessarily thrilled that it seems to me that atheism is true. I think that's an important point to make. The short answer is simply when I look at the evidence and try to evaluate which of the various positions seems most plausible to me, and that of course is a huge sort of topic into itself. It seems atheism just to me seems to be the most plausible. So I think my own thinking has been more on it's like if you're doing some math problem about how much money you have in your account and you get to the answer that you don't have much money. You're like, I'm not so thrilled, but I guess you can double check the math. It still seems right. That's where you end up. So a lot of my thinking has been sort of trying to come to grips with that, and thinking especially about the implications of atheism for morality, which is a lot of what my sort of philosophical work has really been about. And so there was the slide at the beginning that showed my sort of haggard face, and I said the face of atheism. Yeah, that is kind of the face of atheism. But one thing I've spent a lot of time thinking about is I think it is often thought that without a theistic foundation, there really couldn't be objective right and wrong or good and evil. And I do think that that's not correct. And so I spent a lot of time trying to make the case, explain how this could work, how objective morality doesn't really require a theistic foundation. I think that's the part of my view that I'm more excited about and a bit relieved about, I guess you would say. So yeah, if there's a part that I find compelling, it's that there still is objective morality, there still are obligations, there still is real good and evil. And as I said in my talk, there still can be goodness, and we should fight for the goodness that we can attain.
Good. Some similar things. I think that there is the evidence for Christian theism is very strong. Obviously, we're going to disagree about that. We could have a long conversation about various lines of evidence. I don't think it's decisive. I don't think it delivers anything on the level of proof, which is a term a lot of people want, but we don't get that in philosophy very much anyway. But I think there's a very strong case for God's reality, and there's a very strong case that the person of Jesus in history was pretty much what the Christians say he was. It's a long, complicated argument, but I also, the topic tonight and the connection of these stories with what it means to be human, I find compelling in a, not just because of its intellectual robustness. I think we could make an intellectual case this way, but in terms of its existential phenomenology, where this just seems to be fitting with what it means to be human, that our meaning is cosmic and not just Frosty the Snowman meaning as much as we like that. So I do find it compelling. At the same time, I don't actually believe it's irrational to come to a different conclusion. I think there can be different rational conclusions, but I find the case for Christianity pretty strong.
Right. And I appreciate that last comment that you made, where it's like, there is room for dialogue and even for opportunities like this one. So this one might be a challenging one. So here's a question, and we don't always have to go like here.
Yeah.
We can start over here.
Okay.
Is there something in the other position that makes you pause, that makes you wonder, like, that might present a problem or a challenge to my position?
I think, first I want to make a distinction between speed bumps and deeper challenges. Mm-hmm. Many things that Professor Wielenberg has written are speed bumps. I have to stop and think hard about them, right? And this is, why I think your work is so important. And the first three notions don't always seem to work, right? So I think there are lots of things that prompt deeper reflection. But something that's dangling as a real problem, I don't find something that's intellectually decisive or anything like that. I do think that the problem of psychopaths is I'm trying to think of the right...
Speed bump?
No, it's deeper than that. I think it's a deeper thing. I think it has to do with the problem of evil in general, and the deep uncomfortableness with what I think the right answer is I just don't know what God's reasons are, and this is where I have to draw on my confidence in the other parts of the Christian story about the nature of God. Mm-hmm. But when we're looking at that problem head on, sometimes those things don't seem to be as clear or as strong. So I think that the problem of evil when it's focused on particular things is deeper than a speed bump. Yeah. It's something we really need to think about.
I'm disappointed.
Oh, yeah.
I thought it was going to be Frosty the Snowman.
Well, yeah, That's another evil. Yeah. He melted too fast.
So before I just wanted to emphasize maybe a couple areas of agreement between us. What Professor Ganssle was saying before, that you think the case for Christianity is strong, but you don't see it as proof. That's how I see the case for atheism. I think these are very difficult, complicated questions where you're trying to weigh all kinds of evidence, and I certainly don't have any proof of atheism or anything like that. So it's I think we're weighing the evidence in different ways, obviously. And then it seems to me that every serious, developed worldview has unanswered questions and mysteries. And so I think Professor Ganssle is identifying some unanswered questions, or at least questions that he isn't sure what the answer is to them, and perhaps mysteries in his view, and atheism certainly has mysteries as well. And so I think it's just sort of important to recognize that. I think sometimes, especially in less conversational settings, in a more of a debate setting or anything involving the internet, there's a sense of like, you have 5 seconds to respond to this objection, or you must change your way of life, you lose, okay? So that's no way to think about anything really. Okay, but I've delayed long enough. I think to me, the biggest mystery, and it's just a very simple-minded one, where did all this stuff come from? And when I say this stuff, I don't mean this room and the chairs. I mean, of course, all the stuff. Where the heck did it come from?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
I think we're going to bring other two philosophers to tackle that one. I'm just kidding. Well, I mean, from our previous conversation, it's pretty apparent that you guys agree that opportunities like this one are significant on a campus like The Ohio State University, and for students and faculty to consider robustly these ideas that have obviously huge lifelong ramifications. So what I wanted you to do before we move to our Q&A time, based on tonight, what would you challenge Ohio State students to do or to consider going forward?
We might share some challenges for you. We might overlap. I would challenge you to take some time to reflect on what kind of person you should be, what kind of person you want to be. To try to think about your life under the category of virtue rather than under other categories such as pleasure or opportunity or whatever categories are there. Because I think for all of us, regardless of our worldview, that can become the first step to living with an appropriate degree of moral seriousness, which I deeply believe also gives us the best life. So it brings a great deal of joy. And so that would really be the first thing. The second thing would be find, if you can identify a concrete step that you can take soon, by Thursday, maybe a week from Thursday, where you can put yourself in a situation to begin to practice a different way of relating to people. Whether it is simply stopping to ask a question rather than formulating your answer right away. Because we shift into debate mode all the time. I think today, now the smartphone is the opiate of the people, and it's the internet debate culture that renders it very hard for us to think reflectively. But if you could start doing something and say, no, I'm going to pause before I answer. And then if you can succeed in pausing once in the next 2 weeks, you'll at least be taking a first step. I think those are things that all of us can share as applications. And if you're already some kind of Christian, I would encourage you to spend a lot of time reading the stories of Jesus' life and thinking about how he engaged people, and think, how can I begin to engage people this way? I think that will be helpful. If you're not a Christian in any way that you would admit to your friends, you might look at the gospel stories and say, who is this person? Is this a person that could possibly be what the Christians say he is? But I actually would rather emphasize the first two for you, right? Begin to reflect on what kind of person you want to be, and then find a way to take a first step.
My request would be, if you're an atheist and you think Christianity is ridiculous, or if you are a Christian and you think atheism is ridiculous, make a serious effort to look into the ideas of the sort of more serious thinkers on the other side. I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan. It might seem weird. Guy's my hero. Now, he had an atheist phase. I kind of like the atheist C.S. Lewis. Okay, nobody's perfect. But the other...
Professor Wielenberg's book on C.S. Lewis is very good. It's really worth reading.
Which seems weird, but what are you going to do? I think, in my view, neither view is ridiculous. Clearly, I have a view about which is more plausible, but neither view is ridiculous. And I think it's just so common in many debates, but especially debates about religion, for whatever side you're not sympathetic to sort of be caricatured and to not really examine sort of the real or most strongest version of it. So I would, if you think it's ridiculous, I think it probably isn't ridiculous, whether it's true or false. So take a deeper look. That's my request. You don't have to do it by Thursday. Just, you have 1 year.
Yeah.
I will be back here in 1 year to check on your homework.
We'll do evil next year.
Yeah.
Yes, and there will be a quiz on atheist C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
atheist Aslan. But anyway, I'm going to read you a disclaimer now as we transition to the Q&A portion of tonight. And Dr. Ganssle and Dr. Wielenberg will prepare to answer the audience questions. Thank you to all of you who have submitted questions. And now we're going to transition to our Q&A time. And the questions will be coming up here on the screen, and we will begin momentarily. So the first question is, if the Christian story is the best grounding for freedom, why have Christians been so involved in oppressing others? And it seems like either one of you could take a stab at that.
Well, I should say a few things about that. I think there's two levels to the question. There are all kinds of reasons why Christians have failed to live Christianly and even distorted their Christianity in order to oppress. And there are some very dramatic examples we can find in history. The rise of apartheid in South Africa is tied to Dutch Reformed theology in some parts. And there's no denying that this has happened, because human beings within the Christian story, although you don't need the Christian story to tell you this, we tend to bend things to our own interest, right? We have a bending inward, and as a result, it's very hard for us to be giving away power and dignity. And when we have power, we usually try to protect power. The second part of the question is I think the actual historical story is not just a mixed story, but there are many things that we take for granted today in terms of rights that find their root in Christian activity. I mean, one of the most commonly appealed to one is the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in England, which was largely, not only, but largely propelled by a small group of Christian thinkers and politicians. The rise of literacy. One thing that's happening right now, of course, things with human trafficking. Not that only Christians are involved in that, but there are many organizations that have developed out of Christian thinking that are working on this. So I actually think the historical case is much stronger on the Christian side of it. That doesn't take away from the dismal failures of the Christian side, right? And to summarize, the answer is that people fail to live as they ought to live, and that's true for Christians as well as anybody else and we tend to cling to power or do things for our own advantage.
Would you like to comment?
I think I agree. You know, in the Christian, part of the Christian story is that, of course, human beings are corrupted by sin, and Christians are still human beings. So, yeah, I think that's maybe a shorter version of some of what Dr. Ganssle was saying. People often fall short of the worldview that they profess to accept. And becoming a Christian doesn't allow you to escape your humanity.
Thank you. Well, next question is for Dr. Wielenberg. It says, how does something that comes about by a happy accident have the same intrinsic value as something that comes about by an intentionally created divine plan? If it's an accident and there's no intention/purpose for it, then wouldn't it have no value?
So I think intrinsic value is just the sort of thing, if it exists, that a thing has in and of itself. So I think there's the last part of the question is a sort of rhetorical question. It seems to suggest a certain principle that if something is not produced on purpose, then it can't have value. And I think I disagree with the principle. I'm not sure how to argue against it other than through examples. So this was what I was trying to get at with the rose example, where the second rose, it grew from manure, but I think what's relevant here is the fact that it was just, it wasn't planted there on purpose. There was no intention or purpose behind it. It's coming into existence. But that doesn't detract from the beauty of the rose. The rose carries its beauty in and of itself, and I think that there's a kind of value, intrinsic value that works in the same way. So maybe here's an example involving love to try to bring this out. I once had a student who told me the story that, and I think it was true, that he had a girlfriend, and he had originally started dating his girlfriend because she was the sister of this guy that he hated in high school, and he wanted to get back at this guy, and he had some evil plan to date the sister and then, do something, discard her. I don't know what the plan was. But as he tells the story, they ended up falling in love. So there's a case where I think something beautiful and valuable came not even from no intention, but from like an evil intention. That's just how intrinsic value works. It's the value a thing has in and of itself, and it still has that value regardless of the intention behind it. So to a question like this, what seems to me to be the strongest sort of case that this can happen is simply by reflecting on examples like the rose and this student with that who apparently there was a happy ending.
Okay. We got a case of evil boyfriend coming up here. It's an interesting discussion always. Well, for Dr. Ganssle, we got a question coming up. What is your evidence that moral truths exist? And if that depends on God existing, then would you still think that there are moral truths if you weren't Christian?
Right. That's a good question. What's my evidence that moral truths exist? My first response is to say it's obvious. Right? I think we intuit it. So we can take two sentences. George Washington crossed the Delaware River sometime during the Revolutionary War, and it's wrong to torture 3-year-old children to death just for fun. I think they're both true, but I am far more certain of the second one than I am of the first one. I think we have, for lack of a better word, some kind of moral intuition by which we can grasp things that are clear cases. It's not that there aren't hard cases to figure out, but we start with really clear cases. I think moral truths are tied up with the being of God. I'm happy to grant that maybe their truth doesn't depend on God's willing them. God doesn't just say, okay, this is right and this is wrong. But their being is connected to God. But if I didn't believe in God, I would still believe in moral truths. I think it would still be obvious. And I would look around for the next best theory, which is probably Professor Wielenberg's.
Okay, next question is for Dr. Wielenberg. It says, do you believe in an undiscovered true morality, Or do you believe we exist in a world of moral pluralism where each one cannot be proved to be better than another?
So this is interesting. Yeah, good one. So I think the question, the way it's phrased, it kind of suggests that these are two mutually exclusive options. Either there's an undiscovered true morality, or there's a world of moral pluralism where each one cannot be proved. I do think that there is what you would call a true morality, and I think probably we've discovered some of it, but not all of it. But it may well be, so the point about proof goes back to something that we were talking about before. I think in a lot of cases, yeah, people want proof, right? But you can't always get proof. But if we think about how we live our lives, we don't really live our lives, based only on proof. We live our lives based on, probability and what seems most plausible. And so I think it might well be that I think there is a moral truth sort of out there. I think it's an open question as to how much of it we could discover, become reasonably confident of, much less prove. But so it might be the case that we're stuck with a limited kind of moral pluralism in the sense that there might be certain moral debates where we can't really get decisive evidence one way or another, but there might still be a moral truth out there. It might just be beyond the grasp of human beings for some reason.
Okay. Dr. Wielenberg, you get to swing again. It says, you mentioned love being an intrinsic value, having value completely in itself, but isn't love only really of value as something shared relationally? Can love even exist intrinsically, let alone have value?
Okay, another good one. Yeah. When does Dr. Ganssle get one?
We'll give him the next one.
I'll make some comments on this.
All right,
what's going
great.
on?
So, at any point, if you guys want to comment on each other's things, we can.
So I think here with love, the key is to think about, what is it really that is going to carry the intrinsic value here? So I spoke loosely of love having intrinsic value, but of course love is a relationship between persons. So I think there the intrinsic value would lie in the loving relationship between the two people. So it's a more complicated thing, but the idea would be if you have two people loving each other, even in an isolated universe where there's nothing else, I still think there's something good going on there. So I see the idea of the question, love itself is relational, but if we sort of think about, okay, everything that's required for love and this relationship between people, is there intrinsic worth in that? It seems to me that the answer is yes.
Yeah, if I could say something about the intrinsic and extrinsic value discussion. So let's go back to the roses. And we say that both of these roses have the same intrinsic properties, and therefore their intrinsic value, their beauty, will be the same. I want to tell another story that highlights that the intrinsic value is only part of the value story. So you come home from a long day at school, and you open your dorm door, and there are two vases, or if you're sophisticated, vases, and each one has a rose that have all the same intrinsic properties, right? And there's a note to each one. And on the left-hand side, the note is from your roommate, and she writes, "It's the weirdest thing, I found this rose in a dumpster, but I thought it was pretty." And then the one on the right, the note is from your boyfriend who says, "I have been thinking about you all week and I can't wait to spend time with you. I love you." The intrinsic value of both is identical, but the relational component adds to the value. So I'm not sure we have to be so worried about the boundaries between intrinsic and extrinsic value. Because often the extrinsic value is what makes things valuable to us, right? Even things with intrinsic value. I don't know if you want to say any more about that.
No, I agree completely. I would just, intrinsic value is just one type of value. So when I was suggesting that certain things have intrinsic value, I didn't mean to suggest that that would be the only kind of value that exists. So I agree. And there are more interesting and complicated cases where there can be things that are intrinsically bad, but they're extrinsically good because they have good consequences, like terrible tasting medicine would be an example, and you can have the opposite kind of case. So I certainly agree that, intrinsic value is just one of various types of value.
Yes. And this kind of brings our discussion to an end. Thank you, Dr. Ganssle and Dr. Wielenberg, for participating in this discussion. And to me, the value of these kinds of events is that even if the point is not who's the winner, who's the loser, but in some ways, even if we don't come to shared views, at least this kind of opportunity sharpen the qualities of our disagreements. And for that, we're grateful. We're grateful for you being here and participating with us. At the conclusion of this section, we're going to have Dr. Ganssle and Dr. Wielenberg available for about 30 minutes if you want to have an informal conversation with them. And at the conclusion of those 30 minutes, ushers will encourage us to exit this auditorium. So again, thank you, Dr. Ganssle and Dr. Wielenberg, for participating in a special event. On behalf of our sponsoring organizations, we thank you as an audience for your attendance and participation tonight. Thank you.